Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Craig Shirley.
You sit. Yeah. Right here. Sure. Thank you, Melissa.
There's a big old microphone here. Okay. Good evening. My name is Melissa Giller. I have the honor of being the Chief Marketing Officer for the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Thanks for coming in this evening. In honor of our men and women who defend our freedom around the world, can I please ask that you stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. This microphone. So before we get started, I would like to thank Craig's wife, Zareen, who's here with us this evening, and his son, Matthew, who's a first-timer here. So thank you both for coming. It's wonderful to have you here. So it's hard to remember, at least personally for me, where the past 2 years have gone, especially with COVID-19, the lockdowns and the restrictions. And personally, a lot of times I now think and refer to things as pre-COVID and post-COVID. As in, how long have I had my car? Oh, right, I got it just before COVID, so I've had it like 2.5 years. Okay. Or, why am I so short on cash? Right, my daughters got bored during lockdown, went away to college, I'm paying the bills. Okay, I got it. But I still use those time frames of pre and post-COVID, not just for my personal life, but also for my work life. As in, when's the last time I had the privilege of seeing Craig Shirley in person? Right, it was just before the lockdown in February of 2020. He was here on February 13th, 2020 to be precise, exactly 1 month before California and many other states imposed their city and county lockdowns for a minimum of 8 weeks, which if you live locally, you might know, it actually closed the Reagan Library for 14 months. And I can't turn my page, look at that. A lot of people use teleprompters, I think. But we're so thrilled to be back open and to be able to have world-class authors and all-around great human beings like Craig back on our campus. And I think most of us know that Craig is one of the definitive biographers on Ronald Reagan. In fact, the London Telegraph hailed him as the best of the Reagan biographers. But he has proven through books like Mary Ball Washington, Citizen Newt in December 1941, that he's also one of the best historian authors out there. Speaking of which, as I'm sure you all know, he's here tonight to talk about April 1945, his much-awaited book to the previously mentioned December 1941. For me, the book couldn't have come at a better time. See, the Reagan Library's next special exhibition is called The Secrets of World War II, and it opens on April 2nd. It's a collection of hundreds of artifacts from museums and private collections, never before seen together, in order to tell compelling stories of technological advancement, creative problem solving, and incredible human persistence under the backdrop of the world's largest and most destructive war in history. I quickly dug into Craig's book to refresh my memory on the end of the war and to gain insight about what was going on around the world in those final few months. What I quickly found was a history book that read like a novel, a book that covered the war and what soldiers were encountering, just as much as a book that covered what was happening in the home front and abroad, what average citizens were seeing and doing, and even wearing. It is a fascinating look into that era of our history. While preparing for our World War II exhibition, I have had the distinct honor and privilege to interview a handful of World War II veterans, heroes all. But we also needed to speak with some historians to help provide context for our gallery videos of which those veterans' videos would be played. Thankfully, we set up an interview with Craig, which we actually conducted right before this event tonight. So if you do come back to see our World War II exhibition, not only will you see the interviews with our veterans playing in the galleries, you will see our interview with Craig. Craig is an informative and entertaining walking encyclopedia on World War II, which makes me even more excited to bring him up here to discuss his book. So let's get started. Ladies and gentlemen, Craig Shirley.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Melissa.
Of course. So I mentioned to Craig before this started that reading this book led to like 93,000 questions, which I know we're not going to have time for because we want to make sure we have time for your questions as well. So we'll try and get through some of these, and if we don't get to one that you want to hear, we will take questions at the end. So, as I mentioned, you have a book on Newt Gingrich, you have books on Ronald Reagan, you have books on, Mary Ball Washington. You have a book on 1941, and now you have a book on 1945.
Right.
Why did you not just write a book about World War II as a whole?
It's a good question. I don't think I know the answer. It was inspiration one day. I just had this inspiration one day. There've been many books written about World War II, and there've been many books written about December 7th, 1941. Gordon Prang's "At Dawn We Slept" is the standard by which every other book is measured. It's a absolutely marvelous book, but nobody had ever written, to the best of my knowledge, a book about the domestic side of what was going on in the United States during the month of December and how it radically changed, because we changed completely. We changed governmentally, we changed economically, we changed politically, we changed culturally, we changed every which way because of that month. And so I pitched the idea to my publisher. They liked the idea very much, and I wrote it, and took 3 or 4 years to write it, and it came out to good reviews and was a New York Times bestseller. So I didn't have a plan to write April 1945 after. It was not part of my plan to write a companion book, because in the intervening time, in the next 10 years, I wrote several Reagan books, and Citizen Newt, and Mary Ball Washington, and a lot of op-eds and things. But it was just an inspiration that came to me, is that April 1945 is just packed with history. Mm-hmm. Just every day is a red letter day, and so that was what, after thinking about it, I realized that nobody, again, had ever written a book about that monumental month.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that actually leads perfectly into my next question, and I mentioned this to you upstairs before we came down here. You covered, there's a chapter on January, a chapter on February, March,
Right.
April, and then beyond.
Right.
More so in January than the other months, but you literally are saying, on January 1, 1945, these are all the things happening
Yes.
in the United States and the world. And here's what's happening on January 2nd, and here's what's happening on January 3rd.
Yeah.
How do you determine what you're going to cover?
I don't know. When I get up in the morning, I mean, I drive Zerine crazy, because she says, "Why aren't you writing? Why aren't you writing?" I tell her, I am writing. I'm writing in my head. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about it. And then when I sit down at my computer, then it all just, like Raymond Chandler said, just throw up into your typewriter. And that's what I do. I let it all out into my laptop and write it that way. But what was your question?
How do you choose which of these events each day to write about?
I have a list, Melissa. I have a yellow legal tablet, and I have a list of about 25 books I want to write, and it grows ever longer. And the list, I'm going to expire long before the list does. Writing the book, for instance, about Mary Ball Washington really got me interested in the 18th century. So now I want to write something about, not about Valley Forge, but about Morristown, which was actually, it was a winter encampment by the Revolutionary Army, and it was actually far worse than Valley Forge. And this has not been explored enough, so I'm thinking about writing a book about that. But I'm also thinking about writing a book about Bojangles, and I got that idea, actually, Bill Robinson. My father, when he was a little boy, used to go to New York City for the St. Patrick's Day Parade. And Bill Robinson would tap dance down Fifth Avenue, leading the parade. And that always kind of gave me goosebumps. And of course, he was in all those Shirley Temple movies and all that. And I thought, this is and then the song, got me, by the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band. Really, I've had it in the back of my mind for a long time to do, because nobody's ever done a book about Bill Robinson. So that's in the back of my mind. So, I'm going to write more Reagan books. I'm working on 2 right now. One I'm editing, and one I'm actually writing. And then I'm going to write a book about Donald Trump. So my dance card is pretty full.
I'm lucky to remember to brush my teeth. I don't know how you do all that. Back again to the January chapter, just because it kind of struck me interestingly. you're going through each day and you're talking about things like Christmas of 44,
Right,
leading into
right.
January 45. Christmas of 44, it was like Christmas sales shopping spiked
Yes.
by like 17%. And as you're
Right.
talking about all the different months, you're talking about what makeup women are wearing and what hats
Yes.
they're wearing. And
Yes.
so were Americans not as concerned about what was going on in the world in the war? Or,
Oh, no, they're very concerned. Americans is that this nation has always been divided. Historians will tell you that during the American Revolution, as many as 30%, they estimate as many as 30% of the American people were actually opposed to the revolution. We were not unified at all. And as a matter of fact, after the revolution, something like 100,000 people left because they did not want to live under the Articles of Confederation. They went to British Guiana, they went back to Great Britain, and that right there is a book right there, about 100,000 people leaving. The Civil War certainly was an enunciation of our divisions. Is that the only time in the United States history where we've been totally united is the afternoon of December 7th, 1941, and for several months after September 11th. But even then, that didn't last. We're defined by our unit, by our divisions. We've always been divided. We're divided about Vietnam War. We're divided about women's rights, about civil rights, about the environment. We're divided about everything, and then we form consensus. That's the brilliance of the American system of government.
So this is a two-part question. Reading this book, of course, I think we all are aware of what was going on in Germany and the Holocaust and,
Sure.
and Hitler and the Nazis. I think, and maybe I'm just naive, but I forgot about the brutality of Japan. They were. I mean, in your book, you're talking about how they would throw up babies and bayonet them for fun.
Yes,
you know,
that's right. Yes.
So I said two-part questions, but what made it about that era and these leaders that made that acceptable behavior that the countries could get behind, and then
I don't know.
what was it about the Japanese cruelty? I was shocked by it.
Yeah, I don't know how you explain evilness. I don't think rational people can explain evilness, but evil did exist, and evil exists today in the world. Is that the Japanese were, first of all, there was a shogunate culture, a very masculine culture that had grown up over Japan in the 20s and 30s, in which led them to want to create a militaristic government. Hirohito, taking over parts of Indochina, and what led to December 7th. They wanted to have complete control of the Central and Western Pacific without any interference from the United States. But they were absolutely horrible. There's a story in the book here about a Pacific island of Polynesians, and they were thought to be, they were peaceful, loving, native, and they were thought to be sympathetic to America. So the Japanese knew this, and they went in one day and they just machine gunned everybody on the island, just blew them away. They had a group of American Navy POWs. In the shogunate culture, you have to understand, is that the worst form of humiliation is that one man can imprison another man. If one man can imprison another man, then he is not worthy. He's worthless. And they had this attitude, with American POWs. Like, for instance, they had a group of American Navy POWs. So they marched out, made them dig a trench in the sand, marched down inside, and then poured gasoline on them and burned them to death. And the reason it was verified was that actually some escaped and got back to MacArthur's forces and told their tale about them being burned to death. But that was not unusual for that Japanese culture, that Japanese government at the time. They didn't have the regard for life that Americans did. For instance, I say for instance a lot, I'm sorry, is that if a Japanese pilot was down in the Pacific, the Japanese Navy wouldn't pick him up. They just let him go. They just let him drown. If an American pilot was down in the Pacific, he was picked up as soon as humanly possible. They had much different regard for human life than we did in 1945.
Speaking about cruelty and Nazis, I was glad your book didn't just talk about the cruelty of the Nazis, but you also really talked about the insanity of Hitler, if I can use the word insanity.
Sure.
When it was March and April of 1945, and it was clear that the Allies were going to win the war, did Hitler really think he was still going to win? Was
Yes,
was that propaganda?
Yes, he did. Yes, yeah, he was crazy anyway. Let's face it, he was crazy. And we'd actually done the predecessor to the CIA, the OSS, had done a psychological they hired a Harvard psychologist to do a psychological profile of Adolf Hitler. And I talk about it in the book here, but about all the problems, all the screwed up problems of this man. What led him to be the monster that he was, is that right till the bitter end, he believed his own propaganda. All the other Nazi bosses, leaders, all believed their own propaganda. Even as army, Patton's army was advancing, the Third Army and the Soviet army was advancing to the east, they were doing things. They were cutting off food supplies for civilians. They were cutting off communications for civilians. They were doing. They were taking it out on civilians. They were taking from the civilians and giving to the military to stave off the inevitable. But Hitler, right to the end, believed his own lies.
And one of the things that I read in your book that I did not know, speaking of Hitler, is somewhere in here it said that he was considering surrendering because he thought surrendering would help lead to World War III. Can you talk about that?
There was a great debate among Churchill and Stalin and FDR whether or not we would accept surrender from Nazi Germany or whether we wanted unconditional surrender. We wanted them to. We wanted war trials. We wanted, punishment meted out to these thugs who had created this war in the first place. Churchill was for unconditional war, unconditional surrender, whereas Stalin was for unconditional surrender. But there were people around Franklin Roosevelt who were arguing just for surrender, just not unconditional, just let's get it over with. The war is won. Let them stay in power. But there were others, like for instance Eisenhower. Eisenhower wanted Hitler deposed and put on trial, along with all the other Nazi thugs.
Well, which leads perfectly into my next question. FDR was our first and only four-time president, and I'm actually going to read this. He's a president that Ronald Reagan once called an American giant, a leader who shaped, inspired, and led our people through perilous times. How critical was FDR's 4 terms in America's stance, involvement, and victory with the war?
All encompassing. He is, John Patrick Dickens was an historian who's since passed away a couple years ago. He was a friend of mine. He was actually part of the free speech movement at Berkeley and actually did battle with then Governor Reagan over campus protests. But he later, this liberal, became an admirer of Ronald Reagan. He wrote a book called Fate, Freedom, and Ronald Reagan, Fate, Freedom, and the Making of History. And in this book, this liberal professor says that our 4 greatest presidents are George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, and Ronald Reagan. And it makes the academic case, because they freed or saved many, many people. And that was the criteria for greatness, was does a president actually affect the outcome for the betterment of many, many people? And I think, his criteria is pretty good. And so FDR, although he failed with the Great Depression, unemployment in 1939 was the same as it was in 1933, but at least he gave the American people hope. He gave the American people hope, and that was very, very important. He was he was capitalist, but he wasn't a committed socialist or something like that. But he was willing to try whatever worked. The WPA or the the Conservation Corps or other New Deal programs. But where he was really, really masterful was as a war leader, because he didn't interfere. He did what Reagan. I think Reagan. I haven't researched enough, but Reagan believed, the way to assemble a government is you surround yourself with good people and then you let them do their jobs. FDR had that same approach toward the war, and if you think about it, all the brilliant men who he had serving in wartime. He had Eisenhower, and he had Nimitz, and he had King, and he had Patton, and he had Marshall, and he had MacArthur, and he had so many others, Omar Bradley, so many other superb military leaders, and he didn't interfere. He would meet with them, he would ask questions for them, but he didn't interfere. He'd let them conduct the war they saw fit, and that was what his real brilliance was in conducting the war of World War II. But you know, he was for all intents and purposes, he was not just president of the United States during World War II. He was president of the world. We were not only supplying the U.S. serviceman, but we were supplying the British serviceman, and we were supplying the Soviet serviceman. We were sending them foodstuffs and material and uniforms and things, whatever they needed, we were supplying them. So he was running a global war. You know, he was kind of the varsity operator, and Churchill and Stalin were somewhat junior varsity. I know that Stalin conducted a brilliant, not brilliant, but a massive campaign from the east, and many Russians died as a result. But he was still, in terms of supply and command, he was still a junior varsity operator compared to Churchill, or compared to Roosevelt, excuse me.
Well, you know, it's funny because you just said Roosevelt was president of the world, which is literally my next question. I said in my question, you called him in your book the president of the world. So
Yes.
when he passed away, when he died,
Oh, it was earth-shattering.
Yeah, to the world.
You know, yeah, my mother, God bless her, is still alive. She's 89. And she grew up in the 30s, and she, like many other American children, thought we only had 3 presidents. They thought we had Washington, Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt. That's what she thought. And there was no explanation for succession when he died. There was no explanation for, well, the vice president Truman becomes president now. There was no explanation to her that she was, you know, a young teenager, but is that FDR, when FDR died, flags in Moscow were hung at half-staff. Is that it was a world-shaking event. People just couldn't believe it. And of course, you know, it was tragic too. I mean, obviously death is always tragic, but he was only 63 years old, but he was carrying the burdens of the world. He was obviously stricken with polio, so that had to affect him health-wise, including his circulation. He was a good eater, but he didn't eat healthy foods. He, you know, ate a lot of butter and bread and fatty foods and things like that. He had his what Eleanor called his 5 C's. You know, every afternoon at 5 o'clock, he would make himself, you know, not a martini, but old-fashioned or a Manhattan. Those were his 2 favorite drinks. And he would, you know, so he was not drinking heavily, but enough to, you know, cause damage. And then he smoked 2 to 3 packs a day of filterless Luckies. And I know, filterless Luckies are, you know, deadly.
Death.
Death on wheels.
Yeah.
And so and the burdens of running the United States government and running the war, and he's got 4 sons in the military, all in combat, all in danger zones. He's got a wife who's not henpecking him, but she is. I have great admiration for Eleanor Roosevelt. I think she obviously modernized the office of the First Lady, but she was also a very good person, I think. But she had her agenda, and so he had to deal with that. So he's dealing with his family, he's dealing with his White House staff, he's dealing with Congress, a recalcitrant Congress. They didn't go in lockstep with whatever Roosevelt wanted. They often opposed him. So, you know, it's understandable in a way, diet and everything else, the stress, why he passed away at age 63. But it was unbelievable. It was one of those things, and I'll shut up. It was one of those things where people know where they were when they heard it, right? I know where I was on November 22nd, 1963. I know where I was on September 11th. I know I wasn't alive on December 7th, but my parents were, and they knew where they were when they heard about December 7th. And it was the same thing with FDR's passing, was that everybody knew where and what they were doing when FDR died.
So you just mentioned your respect for Eleanor Roosevelt. What was her impact on the war and the American home front as a whole?
Well, she was the head of several different government agencies, but it was more than that. She was a one-woman industrial complex. I mean, she was writing her daily column called My Day. She was doing radio broadcasts every week. She was doing morale and promotional tours, U.S. camps, overseas and in the United States. She was also tending to her family affairs. She was I mean, there wasn't anything she wasn't doing. She truly modernized the office of First Lady, but she did so, I thought, with a lot of grace and charm. You know, and let's face it, she had a rough marriage. He always trusted her. He always said she was his best political advisor. But you know, his affair early on with Lucy Rutherford Mercer, obviously caused great damage to the marriage, and there's no written history on her finding out about FDR's passing away. He almost literally passed away in the arms of his lover, and nobody knew if he consummated it in any way, shape, or form, but he was down in the little White House in Georgia, and his daughter, I can't. It'll come to me. I'm having a senior moment. I beg your pardon. But his daughter Anna had surreptitiously arranged for Lucy Rutherford Mercer to go visit Franklin Roosevelt in the little White House behind her own mother's back. You know, but there's no written. You know, when FDR died, everybody knew that he was with his lover, including obviously Eleanor, but there's no history on Eleanor's reaction to that. She obviously had been very distraught, but like the classy woman she was, she flew down to Young Harris, or to Little White House. She rode the train back, the Ferdinand Magellan, which President Reagan used in '84. And she went to the funeral at Hyde Park. She never ever betrayed her loyalty to her husband, and that's just one reason why I do admire her.
You touched on this a couple of answers ago, but can you talk about the big three, so Roosevelt,
Sure.
Churchill, and Stalin, and
Sure.
how critical they were to ending World War II?
Sure. Churchill was one of the greatest inspirational speakers of the 20th century. And the British people needed his inspirational leadership. Maybe there's a time and place for men, and maybe he wasn't right for the position in an early era, but he was perfect for the position in 1941 and in 1939 actually, when Germany attacked Poland. But no man. I know that I'm trying to think of the phrases of history about the right man at the right time doing the right job, but he was the quintessential right man for the right job. He and Roosevelt were very good friends. He said that meeting FDR was like opening a bottle of champagne. He said that FDR was Great Britain's best friend. They were very good. They got along. He came to visit FDR several times during the war in the White House. They got along very well. Stalin was an outlier because of politics and because of his personal behavior. You know, the way he behaved at Yalta and at Potsdam was obviously off-putting to both FDR and Truman. But FDR did allow Stalin to gobble up parts of Eastern Europe and the Warsaw Pact countries at Yalta. Yalta was interesting. I always wondered why they went along. Yalta was a falling down vacation home for the Russian Tsars. And when the communists came to power, they let it fall into ruin. But they chose it as the site of this important meeting, which is to decide what to do with the world after World War II. How do we divide the world? How do we handle the world? How do we manage the world? You know, they had this arrogance. They could really run, you know, this country or that country or whatever. But Yalta had bad food. It was cold. It was bad. It was falling down. The bedding was bad. All this, and FDR has to travel 12,000 miles there, and Churchill has to travel thousands of miles there, and it's just a hike down the street for Stalin. And he was the most junior member of the Big Three. When, you know, you would have said, okay, let's have the Big Three. Let's have, instead of Yalta, let's have it in Miami Beach. You know, but why they had it in Yalta, nobody's ever explained it adequately to me, and it took a toll. That traveling took a toll on FDR also as well.
How do you think President Truman handled the end of the war?
He always said in his diaries he had no regrets. He never looked back on dropping the bomb at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He believed fervently it was ordered to save millions. Thousands had to die. I wish, my personal perspective is, I wish he had demonstrated the power of the A-bomb first to Hirohito, like in an open water test in Tokyo Bay or something, so he could witness it himself and see what damage it would cause. I wish Truman had done that first, but he never looked back. And obviously, his appointment of Eisenhower as Supreme Commander, and Eisenhower developed these spheres of influence over Germany. You know, the Soviets had this sphere, the Americans had this sphere, and it made a mess. And it led to many of the problems. In fact, maybe led to the problems of today. I haven't analyzed it completely. But on the other hand, Douglas MacArthur's stewardship of Japan was brilliant. He should have won the Nobel Peace Prize. He literally rebuilt the society, the culture, the government, without any violent overthrow or backlash or anything like that. Is that he took over a country that was just bombed out. We had bombed it. The country was just destroyed, and he took it over and rebuilt the whole thing, and made it into a peaceful, democratic country. You know, politically, constitutional democracy, and that appointment by Churchill, by Truman, was a very good one for what MacArthur did.
In 1945, as concentration camps were being liberated, what was the overall feeling from America and other Allied countries when they saw the horror and devastation of what was in these camps?
You know, that's interesting, is that some of the major newspapers started in April of 45, started reporting on these discovered death camps. And by the way, is that when you think of Europe, you think, you know, about World War II, you think about Treblinka, you think about Auschwitz or something. There were dozens of Nazi death camps all over Europe, all over Poland, Hungary, Germany. There were dozens of them. It wasn't just the big ones, the ones that get the notoriety. There were little ones too. Americans were so war weary after it, and it was a crime so big and so monstrous. A lot of people didn't believe it. They just didn't have enough information. They just couldn't comprehend of it. But the major newspapers, as I started to say before, would report on, for instance, the New York Times reported on the discovery of Auschwitz, but never reported that it was Jews who were being killed at Auschwitz. That only came much, much later. Why the New York Times did that, and also, by the way, what the Washington Post did too, is that these camps were being discovered, and they never reported that they reported that people were being murdered, carnage was happening, but they never reported there was Jews or homosexuals or gypsies or Poles or Russians that were being monstrously murdered in these camps.
So when news breaks that pretty close to one another that Mussolini is executed and Hitler's committed suicide, did people believe this? What was the feeling going through the world?
Well, the United States, for a period, we believed that Hitler had during the 30s and during the war, Hitler had a double that looked just like him.
Like Elvis Presley.
Yes, exactly, exactly. So we bought that. But when it was confirmed that it was he who, I mean, we knew we were invading Berlin, we were wiping out Berlin, we knew he was in a bunker, we knew his days were numbered, so we just took it as, I mean, obviously it was a great, wonderful thing that he committed suicide, but we took it kind of in stride. We took a lot of things in stride, I think, because the war had worn down, in a way, the American people. Although we did create the United Nations, and we became forever an internationalist country after World War II. You know, you think about it today, is that if Russia was invading Ukraine in the 1930s, we wouldn't have given it a second thought. We would not have, so what, you know? It's only the legacy of World War II that we care about, even though we don't have, there's not demonstrable American stake in Ukraine, but we're moving toward possible conflict there. And that's a legacy of World War II.
So I think my final question will be one that I actually asked you when we were doing this pre-interview upstairs.
Sure.
I really liked your answer. Why, and this, I realize the absurdity of this question, but why should we care about World War II? Why should we still study World War II?
You know, that's again the memory senior moments, because there are lots of great quotes about the reason to study history. There's the, you know, we study history or we fail to repeat it. He was a, I can't think of his name. He was a Harvard professor. But anyway, is that we should study history for many, many reasons. First of all, it's fun. Second of all, is that we learn not to make the same mistakes over. For instance, I'll give you a perfect example of the first mistake we made over again, and why Biden didn't study, unfortunately didn't study the history. But in 1979, Jimmy Carter was doing an interview, and he was asked if Afghanistan was part of our defensive perimeter, and he said no. And within months, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. Is that Joe Biden a couple months ago was asked about our interest in, or no, he asked about Ukraine, and he said, "What, a little invasion is okay." I'm paraphrasing here, or something like that. But anyway, he telegraphed to Putin he could make the move without cause for concern, and so now he's had to obviously backtrack on that previous thing. But imagine if he'd been more careful with his words, how this might not have happened. So that's a good example. That's as good an example as anything I can learn, I can think of about. We study history to learn from it. But you know, it gives us a sense of dignity. It gives us a sense of purpose. It gives us a sense of where we belong. It gives us, you know, we need to know why. Like for instance, when the Second Continental Congress, when they were working on the Constitution, is that the First Amendment, everybody knows about, you know, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, but oddly jammed in there is freedom of the press. It doesn't really fit, but it's in there because, not because the founders liked the pamphleteers and tabloids of the time. They hated them. They despised them. But they saw the newspapers as a valuable ally of the American people against their government. And so it's important that we know why we have freedom of the press in this country today.
That's great. So I have 93,000 more questions, and if there aren't questions from the audience, I will continue to ask. But if you have any questions, we just ask that you raise your hand. We are recording this, so it's important that we bring a microphone to you before you ask your question. So if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. Otherwise, I'll just keep asking. Yeah. Wait, hold on one second, sir. There we go. Go ahead.
What if the world would have invited Russia into NATO in the last 25 years? Would it be a different world?
It might be. It might be. I'm not an expert on world affairs. I can't do a deep answer for you. It might have been. If I had been in a position to invite them in, I would have invited them in. You know, it's always better to have, you know, to deal with the adversary that you know rather than the adversary you don't know. I wish I could answer that question more fully for you, but I'm not an expert on that type of. But I think you agree with me. You're nodding your head. So is that maybe things would be better? Certainly after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the advent of with the breakaway republics and the Warsaw Pact. Is that I can't imagine why. Obviously, it's politics. Obviously, there are people against it, but bringing people in to talk is always, I think, is always better to negotiate peacefully rather than being sent into wartime. So, I'm sorry I can't answer that better for you, but it's a good question.
Any other questions from anyone in the audience?
So I heard the good news there that you are going to write 2 more books about Ronald Reagan.
Yes, yes.
All right, that's pretty exciting. So, can you give us a sneak peek?
Sure, yeah, sure.
Sing
Well,
on.
first of all, let me say is that Serene knows that, doing all this keeps me off the streets and out of the pool halls. I'm editing a book about Reagan and Grenada, and Grenada is significant because it's the end of détente. It's the end of détente, and it's the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. It leads the straight line projection of history from Grenada to the fall of the Berlin Wall and then the eventual fall of the Soviet Union and liberation of the Warsaw Pact countries. I'm doing a book on also Reagan the negotiator, Reagan the compromiser, Reagan dealing with people on the other side, like for instance, picking George Bush. He didn't want to pick George Bush, but he made the most sense at the time at the Detroit Convention to produce a unified ticket. The Republican Party has more or less been divided since the 1940s, and with liberals or moderates and conservatives. And you had Eisenhower, the moderate, and Nixon, the conservative, or Lodge, the moderate, and Nixon, the conservative. So that continued that program where he had to reach across to pick Bush to unify the convention. Unified conventions tend to win in the fall, and divided conventions tend to lose in the fall. But also, he tried to pick Richard Schweiker, who was then a senator from Pennsylvania, as his running mate in 1976 to try to win the nomination over Gerald Ford. There's a chapter on the Briggs Amendment. This is interesting. Tells you the suppleness and sophistication of Reagan's thinking was that in 1979, as he's getting ready to run for president one more time, there's an amendment in California called Proposition 6, which was the Briggs Amendment. And the proposition prohibited gays from teaching in the public schools or advocating a gay lifestyle. Now, Reagan needs the support of family groups, there were pro-family groups and things like that running for president, but this also offends his deeply felt principle about privacy and dignity and all these other things. So Reagan was the only major conservative in California to come out against Proposition 6. And in the summer of '79, it was winning 2-1. It lost in November by 2-1. And John Briggs, who was state senator at the time, he was going to use this as a vehicle for national office, and it backfired. He saw what Anita Bryant was doing in Dade County and was going to kind of ride this issue. And Briggs was asked the day after why Proposition failed, and he says Ronald Reagan, and that was it. And Reagan never suffered any political consequences, fortunately for him. Family groups still supported him running for president. So, but every chapter is on Briggs, on Bush, on Schweiker, on the Screen Actors Guild, on things like that. So, yes, sir. Ma'am, sir.
Getting back to the book in 1945.
Yes.
Back in September of '39, Stalin and the Russians invaded Poland from the eastern portion as Hitler came in from the west.
Right.
Yet, by the time '45 rolled around, it seemed like Stalin was much more powerful in the Big Three than he had any right to be, not only being a junior member, but being a turncoat. At the beginning of the war, he was part of the Axis powers.
Right.
What do you think, by the time 45 rolled around, gave him that gravitas with Roosevelt and with Churchill?
You know, I'll try to answer as best I can, is that the Soviets got a very, very favorable press in the United States. Look magazine and Life magazine, which went out to millions every week, you can't underestimate their influence, you know. But they depicted the Soviet Union as a worker's paradise. Is that, you know, you know, the moniker Uncle Joe was used often by the intelligentsia. So he had a very, even though he was killing millions with his resettlement programs and things like that, is that he got very favorable press in the United States. He had a lot of sympathetic supporters. There were a lot of, you know, it was not, if you called somebody a communist in the 1930s, it didn't carry the same heavy burden as if you called somebody a communist today. We were, I won't say we were more open, but we were more uneducated about the collectivism or the socialist philosophy. And also is that you have the contrast, is that it's Stalin versus Hitler, Stalin versus Mussolini, Roosevelt versus Hitler, Roosevelt versus Mussolini. So he wins, versus Tojo. He wins basically by default, by comparison, because you know what? This guy's even worse than this guy. So I hope that explains it. Yeah, you bet.
I know there's more questions. We're going to go back to you, but I just had a question, something just popped in my head. I got to speak with a different historian last week, and he said something that I found really interesting. It's
There are no other historians.
There are no other historians. This author, you know, cobblestone together, he said something I thought was interesting. He said, yes, we won the war because of Normandy, because of Iwo Jima, because of
Yes.
you know, the atomic bomb.
Right.
But we really won the war because of Detroit and
Oh, yeah,
Seattle
absolutely.
and the American factories. Can you talk about that?
Sure. No, whoever you talk to is absolutely right. Is that maybe you just stumbled into the truth? I don't know. Is that 3 weeks immediately after December 7th, Roosevelt tells Detroit, "You're not going to make any more cars," and we didn't make any new cars for the duration of the war. People had to drive. I remember my grandfather saying, "Well, I bought that LaSalle before the war, but I sold it after the war." Is that the Roosevelt administration nationalized a lot of industry, including Detroit. He told Detroit, he says, "You are not going to make cars anymore. You're going to become the arsenal of democracy." And interestingly enough, or miraculously, is that within 3 weeks of December 7th, 1941, we were taking fabricated parts from Ford Auto Parts, Ford Auto Body, from Fisher Auto Body, and Goodyear, and we're manufacturing B-24s and B-25 airplanes 3 weeks after, and that happened all over the country. Kelvinator was a company in Detroit that made women's appliances. They made refrigerators, and they made mixing
Mixers.
bowls, and they made cake mixers and
Sure,
things like that.
sure.
And again, in a short period of time, now they're making helmets, and they're making propellers for fighter planes. But it's like that all over the country. It's that this country, or this company, that company, whatever. You stop making, this thing and start making that thing.
Mm-hmm. And then the women in the workforce as well.
Yes. I think I told you before, Melissa. Both my grandmothers were Rosie the Riveters. One was a machine gun inspector. She would stand there, and machine guns would come down the conveyor belt, and she'd pick it up and she'd fire it like this, and then she'd put it down, and the next one would come and she'd pick it up and fire it, and that was her war work. And then my other grandmother was a bomb inspector, and I have no idea what a bomb inspector does, but she was a bomb inspector. I never got a chance to ask her about that, but I certainly wouldn't want that job anyway.
That's crazy.
But there were women. It was not unusual at all. In fact, it was very usual for women during World War II to leave the kitchen and go to the factory floor. They were doing it. They were also participating too. Is that there's a rundown airfield back there in Massachusetts, or back there in Virginia, which is no longer in use, but it used to be a refueling stop for women flying B-24 planes to Europe. They'd stop there, they'd fuel up, and then fly 3,000 miles across the Atlantic to deliver B-17 bombers to the American servicemen.
It's incredible.
Yeah,
Absolutely
yeah, it really
incredible.
was. It is a time I doubt we'll ever see again in the history of this country or the world.
We will go back to the audience. I know there were a handful of hands. Are there any other questions?
Gentlemen back there.
Hold on, let's bring the microphone to you. 1 second.
Thank you. Just to touch on your point about women,
Whoops.
Goodness.
women participating, during the war. Professionally, I know a lot of the women that played professional baseball during the World War II era.
Yeah, that's
41 to
right.
43.
I deal with that in this
Yeah,
book too.
4 months, and I have not read your book yet, but the 4 months they were off, they all came out here, especially like Santa Monica Airport, and they were, like you said, riveting, building planes, doing this. They all did that. They all came from the Midwest to the West Coast, vacation time, but they would do that. 90% of those women did that and dedicated.
Yeah.
And your military female soldiers, when they were discharged, they became escorts to these teams. They taught the women order, discipline, while playing ball too. So yes, I'm glad that you expounded on that, because the women did have a big part during World War II domestically.
Yeah. Again, back to my mother. She grew up in the Midwest, and she, as a child, went to see women's baseball in Illinois. Yeah.
Writing this book and researching this book, is there something that surprised even you as you were finding out the different research?
A lot. As a matter of fact, I can think of three things right now. Is that, first of all, Bill Buckley, who is the founder of National Review, was in the Army at the end of World War II. He was part of the honor guard for Franklin Roosevelt's funeral. Imagine, he said he used his magazine to bash the New Deal and FDR for the rest of his life, and he was part of the honor guard. The second one, by the way, this should be a movie, is that Zareen and I, we had a neighbor of ours down back in Virginia by the name of Dick Snyder. Now, Dick Snyder had a great story in and of itself. He was part of the only 3-year class at West Point that was rushed out to get into the war. He flew P-47s, close air support for the D-Day invasion. He was shot down. He survived, fortunately, but he was hidden in a Belgian farmer's barn, and he was there for about 3 weeks before German patrols picked him up, and he went into a POW camp and spent the duration of the war in the POW camp. Before he left, in gratitude, he gave the Belgian farmer's wife his silk parachute, which silk was highly prized. Flash forward now 50 years later, is that Dick's wife Mary was a great surfer of the internet. She's elderly, but she's very proficient with a computer. And she comes across a story about a woman in Belgium who is getting married, and she's getting married in a silk dress made by her great-great-grandmother of the parachute of an American pilot. And every woman in that family going down from the 40s right up to the present had worn that parachute. Had worn that parachute that made into a wedding dress.
That is incredible.
Yeah. The third one too is that how deeply FDR's funeral, FDR's death affected everybody. Bob Dole was in Italy, and he wrote in his book about American GIs in their foxholes, hearing them weeping over FDR's passing. So his death affected Americans very grievously.
We're almost out of time. I'm going to ask one last question, then we'll go to the book signing. As I mentioned in the intro, I've had the fortune of interviewing a handful of veterans, 99 years young. They're
Right.
spectacular. And a lot of them share the story that they were, 15, 16, 17, joining the war. And in fact, one said he joined the Navy at the age of 17 to learn how to fly. And at the age of 17, he proved to be so proficient, he became a trainer, and he was training other pilots how to fly, and he was
right,
17.
right.
Can you talk about the heroism of these kids?
Yeah, is that the one who comes to mind, obviously, is my uncle, is that everybody in my family, and my family is not unusual, it just gave me a lot of ideas and inspiration, is that my uncle, Ellsworth Abbott Shirley, nicknamed Barney, was shot down and killed on his 20th birthday in January of 1945. He had enlisted when he was 17. He got his parents' permission. It was really messed up, about enlistment. There was the enlistments and the draft, and the ages kept changing. And did you need parents' permission or didn't? But at the time, if you were 17, you could enlist if you had your parents' permission. But there were obviously a lot younger boys who were just, telling with a wink and a wink to the draft board, were going into active duty as young as 15 years of age. So it was not unusual for literally boys to be fighting this war.
And when we were upstairs, you shared, and I just thought that was really great, why they were joining. Do you remember what you said?
Oh, sure. Well, they weren't. I'll tell you why they weren't joining. They weren't joining for the food because it was uniformly mediocre. They weren't joining for the pay because it was lousy. They weren't joining for the benefits because they were non-existent. They were joining certainly for the camaraderie because everybody came back and talked about their friends and their buddies and things like that they made in the war. But they're definitely enlisting for the patriotism. They wanted to fight and win for their country.
And on that note, we are going to thank Craig for coming out tonight. So if you have not, this is not the book because I'm actually holding a pre-sale. This is the book. If you've not purchased a book yet, please go and buy one in the museum store right behind us. Craig and I are going to walk out and get